Our first speaker of the morning is a very close personal friend of mine. He served 24 and a half years in the Congress of the United States, beating me by 2.5 years. He was saying just a few moments ago to me, though, the last 2 or 3 years seemed like 50 to him, and I can attest to the same thing. The last 2 or 3 seem like 50 years to me also. You get to a point where you've done things over and over and over again, and in the last 10 years or so, it has become so difficult to get things done in Washington, D.C., it becomes extremely frustrating and disappointing to everyone that is there. I think that's one of the reasons you see as much turnover as you do in the House of Representatives, and even in the Senate. Jerry Costello was the chairman of the Aviation Subcommittee in the House of Representatives. If he had stayed a few more years, he probably would have been chairman of the full Committee of Infrastructure and Transportation. I do want to say that the thing that probably endeared me most to Jerry Costello was that he was one of the greatest originator of what we used to call projects of national and local significance. Other people might call them earmarks. But Jerry knew what his community needed. In the 24 and a half years, he never missed a year without getting something for his local community. In fact, when he started in Congress, Belleville, his hometown, used to be about the same parallel as St. Louis, Missouri, as you cross over the Mississippi River. After the 24 and a half years that Jerry was there, Belleville and the area surrounding Belleville has had so much hardware put in there, it has sunk down 150 miles. It is now almost in Mississippi. But he was extremely effective. He didn't make a lot of speeches. He spoke what he had to, but he certainly knew how to work the levers of power. He became an extremely influential individual, and I am sure that he will be a very enlightening, entertaining speaker for you this morning, my very good friend Jerry Costello. Jerry?
Well, good morning. Let me thank my good friend Bill Lipinski for his kind words and his friendship over the years. As Bill indicated, when I was elected to the Congress, I immediately went on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, and Bill took me under his wing. We worked together the entire time that he was in Congress until he retired. He chaired the Aviation Subcommittee when I was on that committee the entire time that he chaired it and was ranking member. We worked very closely together on projects, not only for his district and my district, but for the state of Illinois and for the nation as a whole. So, Bill, let me say that I've always appreciated your friendship. He has always been there to return my phone call. He has been returning many of my phone calls in the last 3 weeks since January the 3rd, my last day in Congress. I've called him many times and I said, you know, Bill, the first thing that I noticed the day after I left Congress is that I looked in the mirror the first morning shaving, and I realized that I was looking at my staff, because I have no staff now. You'll notice that other speakers will have PowerPoints and they will have typewritten speeches. You can see that mine was written on paper because my staff is not around to do it for me anymore. Actually, I am in the process of hiring staff and starting a consulting business, but that is for another day. Let me say that it's a pleasure to join you this morning. I participated in this symposium 2 years ago, I believe it was, when we had a panel of members of Congress. I know that Congressman Jimmy Duncan from Tennessee participated on that panel, as well as Dan Lipinski, Congressman Dan Lipinski and others. And I enjoyed it very much. As I look around the room, I see a number of people from the U.S. Department of Transportation, from IDOT, from many other agencies that I have worked with over the years and have had a working relationship with. a number of others that I've worked with, not only in aviation, but in the transportation field, so it's good to see all of you. I'm sorry that Speaker Hastert cannot join us this morning, and I think Bill will explain why in just a little bit. Denny Hastert, when he was Speaker of the House, did an outstanding job not only for the country but for the state of Illinois. He was very understanding, very kind. He was a person that would listen and a person who would be helpful if he could. And it was because of his leadership and the friendship that we in the Illinois delegation established with him that Illinois benefited greatly under his leadership when he was Speaker of the House. Matt Rose is here somewhere, who is the CEO of Burlington Northern Railroad. You know, oftentimes you hear out of the White House and other places about these CEOs of major companies and how they suck all the profits out of the company and do not put any money back into infrastructure. They rely on the government to do so. The fact is that Burlington Northern and Matt Rose are completely the opposite of what some have described CEOs in business in America today. And in fact, they not only make a profit, but they take their profits and put a large part of those profits back into infrastructure. And I think that Burlington Northern just made an announcement recently that they are investing $4 billion in capital expenditures in the coming year. So I want to say thank you to Matt Rose and to our friends at Burlington Northern who are here. As I was looking over the list of speakers that you will hear from both this morning and this afternoon, I have to say that you have some excellent speakers who will follow me on this next panel and throughout the day. Some have firsthand experience with private-public partnerships, not only firsthand experience, but they either in the past or currently are involved with private-public partnerships. They know the promises and the pitfalls and the path forward. They know that what mistakes have been made with some PPPs and what some of the success stories are so that we can go forward and develop a blueprint for us to be able to use private investment to address some of our infrastructure needs. What I hope to do this morning is to just touch on very briefly three areas. You'll hear from folks later on about specific private investment partnerships. So what I want to talk about a little bit is the crisis that we are experiencing with our infrastructure in the United States today. And we truly are experiencing a crisis with our infrastructure. Two, I want to talk a little bit about how we should be exploring all funding options, including private-public partnerships. And three is to talk a little bit about the challenges going forward. Then I hope to leave just a few minutes for questions and answers. I always like to reserve time to take questions, so I'll try and do that watching the clock here. Some of you may know that when I chaired the aviation subcommittee, I was very skeptical of private-public partnerships when it came to airports. When the Daley administration in the city of Chicago proposed privatizing Midway Airport, I had major concerns. I not only met with the administration, but I met with a number of people involved in the process. My skepticism was not that it was the city of Chicago or the Daley administration or anyone involved in the process, but I was skeptical because I had read about other private-public partnerships that did not work out well. That some governments, when they are short on revenue, as many of the cities and states are today and have been for the past few years, that they would use PPPs to get the money up front, get as much cash in as they possibly could. In some cases, millions of dollars, in other cases, billions of dollars on the front end. Spend that money any way that they decided to spend it with very few restrictions. And I was concerned that on the back end, that the taxpayers may get the short end of the stick. And I was also concerned that they'd not only get the short end of the stick, but the private investor who took over the airport would in fact not put money back into maintenance and maintaining the runways and the taxiways as well as the terminals. So that was my concern at the time, and it is my concern today. But I believe that there is a way to do public-private partnerships in a way that serves the public, the taxpayers, as well as provides a return for the investor that is a reasonable return with guarantees and agreements that in fact are enforceable. I could imagine someday under some of the proposals that were floating around that you would drive your car to the airport and instead of paying $5 or $10 or $15 a day to park, you'd be paying $50 or $75. That you'd go to the concession stand and instead of paying $5 for a sandwich, that you'd pay $15 or $20 for a sandwich. There is a way to address private-public partnerships so the private investor does not have the latitude or the flexibility just to raise prices at any given time without any responsibility to the public or to the local entity. So I do believe that we have to look at every funding option. While I was skeptical of PPPs in the past, I do not believe today that we can afford not to look at private-public partnerships. We are truly facing an infrastructure crisis in this country today. All of you in this room know that, or you wouldn't be here. You're all involved in infrastructure and in transportation. Unfortunately, the public does not realize that we have a crisis on our hands. The only time that they realize it is when a bridge collapses in Minnesota or elsewhere in the country and people die. Then the news reports are that there were deficiencies in the bridge, things that should have taken place in capital expenditures, and that is when the public is informed. Then the news media goes away, the public focuses their attention on something else, and so does the media. The American Society of Engineers, they estimate that we will need to spend over $1 trillion by the year 2020 just to address the needs that we have today. Over $1 trillion in the next 7 years just to address our deficiencies. And if you take a look at their report, they have concluded that with our infrastructure system, that the total needs for surface transportation, $1.7 billion. Water and wastewater total needs $1.7 trillion. Water and wastewater $126 billion. Electricity $736 billion. Airports $134 billion. And inland waterways and marine ports $30 billion for a total of $2.7 trillion. Now, expected funding sources, both from the federal, state, and user fees, add up to about $1.657 trillion in expected funding. That doesn't mean that the funding is guaranteed. That's funding that is expected to come in. And even with that level of funding, the $1.6 trillion, the funding gap is still almost $1.1 trillion. So we truly do have a crisis on our hands, and we in fact cannot wait any longer to address the needs. The nonpartisan group, America's Future, you've heard of the group. It is formed, and the purpose of America's Future is to promote infrastructure spending, to address the problem and make the public aware that we have a crisis on our hands. It was formed, and the active participants are Governor Rendell from Pennsylvania, former Governor of California, Arnold Schwarzenegger, and the Mayor of New York are actively involved in this campaign. That group, America's Future, They have taken a look at rail infrastructure in the world today. They rank the United States 18th in rail infrastructure. They looked at our air transport system, and they rank our air transport system as 30th in the world. The United States of America, our rail system, infrastructure system for rail, is ranked 18th in the world, and our air transport system 30th in the world. One of every 4 bridges in the United States today is deficient. That doesn't mean that they're going to close tomorrow or the next day. Some of them have been closed. I've had 2 bridges in the area that I formerly represented in Congress. 2 bridges closed because they were so bad that they were dangerous to the traveling public. But 1 of 4 bridges in the United States today that you and your family and our children and our grandchildren will be traveling on have some form of deficiency. Our infrastructure is crumbling as we speak. In the past, we could count on leaders like Denny Hastert and Bill Lipinski and Congressman Dan Lipinski and others, our federal government and the Congress of the United States, to pass legislation to address some of these needs, to pass a long-term highway and transit bill to address some of the needs of our country, to pass a water resources bill, a WRDA bill, a water resources development bill, to address some of the problems that we face with our water infrastructure, and an aviation bill for our air traffic control system and our airports. These infrastructure bills flew through the Congress in the past. Bipartisan support, very little argument, very little debate, large support, and passed the Congress and were signed by presidents, both Democratic presidents and Republicans. Last year, Congress finally passed a surface transportation bill, a highway bill. Not a 5-year bill, not a 6-year bill like we have in the past, so that Department of Transportations around the country could plan on a 5 or 6 year basis. But the bill that was passed is for 18 months. It was better than nothing, but for 18 months. After there were extension after extension, because there could not be an agreement between both parties in the House and the Senate. Last year, Congress passed an aviation bill, reauthorizing the Federal Aviation Administration, funding all of the programs, the air traffic control system, all of our air traffic control towers, all of the equipment and maintenance for all of our airports around the United States. We passed that bill after 23 extensions, meaning when the last bill expired, which Bill Lipinski was involved in when he was in Congress, when that bill expired, we had to have 23 extensions because Congress couldn't agree on an aviation bill to reauthorize the FAA. Finally, last year, we were able to pass a reauthorization bill. Let me give you an example of how Congress has changed since the days of Speaker Hastert, since the days of Congressman Bill Lipinski. In 2009, when I chaired the Aviation Subcommittee, we tried to get an aviation bill passed, and we did. We actually sat down. The chairman of the full committee at the time was Jim Oberstar. The ranking member was John Mica. I chaired the Aviation Subcommittee, and Tom Petri from Wisconsin was the ranking member. The 4 of us sat down after talking to our members on both sides of the aisle. We said, let's forget about what we disagree. We know where the disagreements are. What can we agree on? We walked out of the room after several weeks of negotiating, and about 98% of what was in that bill we agreed on. We found that there were only really 3 items that we could not agree on. So we said, let's take it to the members, pass it out of the House, get an agreement in the Senate that we will vote on those three issues separately. If the Senate passes them, we'll live with it. If they fail to pass those amendments, then we'll live with that. That bill passed the House of Representatives with huge bipartisan support, enough to override a veto. It increased the fuel tax, both on general aviation and on commercial aviation. It lifted the cap from $4.50 to $7 for the passenger facility charge, which Bill Lipinski was very instrumental in getting placed in the bill, the creation of the passenger facility charge, so that airports like O'Hare in Atlanta and airports around the country that had terrible congestion problems, that there was a mechanism for them to be able to fund their infrastructure needs. So we increased the fuel tax. We lifted the cap on the PFCs from $4.50, and the new cap was $7. And we increased funding for the overall bill. Flew out of the House, went over to the Senate, got tied up in the Senate over some extraneous issues, and never made it out of Congress. Fast forward, we have an election in 2010. We have a new makeup of the House and a new majority. I become the ranking member on aviation, and Tom Petri becomes the chairman. Oberstar becomes the ranking member on the full committee, and John Mica becomes the chairman. John Mica walks in a room one day and says, look, we've got good news and bad news. We just met with the leadership. The good news is about 95% of what was in our bill that we agreed on, we're going to keep in the new bill. What we're going to do, though, is the increased funding for the overall bill, we're going to roll back funding levels to 2008. The increase in the user fee, the fuel tax, there will be no increase. Lifting the cap on the PFC from $4.50 to $7, that's a non-starter as well. It will remain at $4.50. And I said, John, you voted for these things. We all voted for them. It flew out of the House. And he said, Jerry, there's a new day here. We have members who have signed pledges that they will not increase taxes. And I said, this is not a tax increase. No one pays this but the users. And John said to me, they consider user fees a tax. So there will be no user fee increase on fuel, or we won't increase the PFC. Because of the federal budget deficit that we face today, and because of the reduced revenue produced by the gasoline tax that we have relied on to fund a highway and transit bill for a number of years, revenue is down because of more fuel-efficient cars, and because of the partisan bickering in the Congress on both sides of the aisle, I might add. I have little confidence that the Congress will change much in the future when it comes to long-term highway bills or long-term funding bills for our infrastructure. That is why we need to explore other funding options, and that is why I commend Bill Lipinski and Northwestern Illinois University for holding this symposium today. Private-public partnerships are used extensively, as many of you know, throughout Europe and the rest of the world. In fact, our friends over in Canada have 150 private-public partnerships under construction or actively underway as we speak. The United States has partnered many times with, from the private sector to local government, state government, and the federal government, with design-build projects in other ways, many ways. You'll hear about some of those projects from other speakers this morning. You'll hear from folks that are involved with the Skyway here in Chicago and with the CREATE program, which again Bill Lipinski, Denny Hastert, myself, and others worked on. It's a critical project for not only the city of Chicago, but the freight rail industry and for our country as a whole. So you'll hear from those folks in just a little bit. The majority of the private-public partnerships in the United States have taken place in Florida, Texas, and California. The Midwest has been slow to jump on board with the private-public partnerships. I suspect, though, as the state budgets, their revenue continue to decline, and they have other responsibilities facing their budgets, I suspect that we will see more and more state governments turning to private-public partnerships to help them meet the challenges of our infrastructure needs. The challenge going forward to address our infrastructure crisis, as I see it, one, is we have to convince the American people that there is an infrastructure crisis and that they have something at stake in this. It's about public safety. It's about saving lives. It's about helping the economy and growing the economy by investing in our infrastructure. That message has to come from the White House. It has to come from elected officials at every level. It has to come from the business community. And we all have to be on the same page because the American people have to be convinced. And if they are not, they will not support additional revenue, and they will not support private-public partnerships when they are proposed in this state, in this city, or in other areas of our country. We have to examine all funding options, including PPPs. What we also need to do is take a look at where private-public partnerships have worked. And there are examples here in the United States, not many, but some, and there are examples in other parts of the world. When we choose to go with a private-public partnership, we need to make certain that there is transparency, that in fact the taxpayers understand why we're asking for private investment in our infrastructure. We need to make certain that we have agreements that spell out specifically the responsibilities and the restraints on both investors and the government that is entering into this partnership. And we have to make certain that the taxpayers are protected in the long run, as I mentioned earlier in my remarks. Let me say that I also believe that the U.S. Department of Transportation needs to formulate some guidelines. There have been recommendations made by a panel that have studied issues with private-public partnerships and others. In fact, a former staff person, a respected former staff person, senior level of our Transportation and Infrastructure Committee in the House, laid out exactly what those recommendations should be so that we have models to follow that the states can follow. And based upon what I've seen thus far, and I suspect there may be some disagreement in this room with me and with my observations, and certainly in this city, but based upon what I have seen thus far, I think Mayor Rahm Emanuel in the city of Chicago seems to be moving in this direction and in the right direction. And that is that he has worked with the Federal Aviation Administration in looking at the new proposal to enter into a private-public partnership with Midway Airport. He is receiving the guidance of the Federal Aviation Administration and getting technical assistance from them. PPPs can work if they're executed properly. There are investors, willing investors out there. Many of the financial institutions, the largest ones in the United States, have infrastructure components, and they have money. They are ready to invest. Both private and public pension funds are looking for a safe, reliable return on their investments, and they are looking to invest in infrastructure. Many pension funds at every level have already, in other states, in Florida, in California, and in Texas, invested in infrastructure improvements. So as we go forward, the challenges that we have are very clear. The fact that we have been able to rely on our federal government for massive sums of money to address these challenges, in my judgment, is no longer the case and will not be in the near future. So it is up to us, those of us who care about the crisis that we are facing with our infrastructure, to get the message out to the American people that we cannot wait any longer, that we are examining options, and we need to come up with a model for private-public partnerships so that we can, in fact, attract private investment in our infrastructure issues. Bill, I think we have just a few minutes, but I'd be happy to take a few questions. If there are any questions from the audience or any comments or suggestions, or if anyone wants to add anything.
Just a note, if you could please use the mics that we have stood up in the center aisle or up on the top. If you'd like to ask a question, please go to a mic and state your name.
I was going to say, this is a pretty easy group. You know, normally on my farmer job, I used to talk to college students and high school students, and they'd line up to pepper me with questions. Yes, sir. Joe?
So I'm not going to use the mic because I'm too lazy to do that, but what's your sense, and you've laid out the problem, what's your sense that we'll be able to move these ideas through the Congress in its current state?
Well, first of all, I think we have to come up with a plan. Right now, when you look at when private-public partnerships have been used in this country, there's not a model. And it's not that every project is the same, and it's not that you can have a cookie-cutter formula for everything, but there needs to be a model. And what needs to happen, and it has happened, and in fact, I hope that in the next panel that Matt Rose may talk a little bit about that, because he was involved in a study, a committee or a commission that took a look at financing and what we should do for the future. We need to come up with a model for states to follow that, in my judgment, allows flexibility to the states and to local units of government, but also allows the people, the American people, to understand that this is a model that has been successful in the past. This will protect your investment. This will protect you from exorbitant increases in prices, and anyone from Chicago knows the example is with the PPP with the parking meters here in the city. It will protect you, and it will provide safeguards so that the private investors get a reasonable return on their money, but they do not get to decide what to do and when to do it without the input of their partners in the public sector. Yes?
How do you know a public-private partnership, how do you know a project of national significance when you see it?
Every one that I've ever looked at in my district was of national significance. You know, Create, for instance, is a project of national significance, and I don't think that anyone would doubt that. We have a new Mississippi River Bridge connecting Illinois and Missouri in the St. Louis area. That was a project of national significance in the last highway bill. That bridge, some people said, well, you're just building a bridge. Well, actually, that bridge will take truck traffic off going from coast to coast coming through St. Louis. So it is of national benefit. So when you take a look at a project and you say, is this a project of national significance? It needs to meet the test. Will others benefit other than just a particular state or a particular congressional district? I think we've got time for one more question, and Mr. Lipinski's got the hook out.
Regarding public-private partnerships, they depend on having a revenue stream because otherwise the private sector isn't going to be interested in having a partnership. And I think they lend themselves to cherry picking, kind of the plums, like the Midway Airports. versus the bread and butter capital maintenance of infrastructure. So how would you structure a public-private partnership to address that routine capital maintenance that we're facing?
Well, I think what you have to do is, you know, the devil is always in the details, and it is in the agreement. You know, if the agreement is not structured and fair on both sides, the fewer safeguards that you build in for the taxpayer and the government side, the more lucrative the deal is for the investor. And we have to understand that going in, that if you give away the farm, people are going to pay more money. But there are also investors out there who want to make a reasonable return on their money. Pension funds, many of the, as I mentioned, the large financial institutions in the United States today, they would love to have a return of 10 or 12 or 14% on their money. And they are willing to invest. I am I'm involved with a board right now that just is back in the business of loaning money for infrastructure projects, public projects, wastewater treatment plants, and things of that nature. They suspended their involvement for a few years, but they are back in the business because they are seeing returns now on their money of 7 to 10% in the two projects that were recently entered into with this group. So I think there has to be a balance. If the partnership is the private investor wants to make 25 or 30 or 40% overall, that's not a partner that you want. It's the partner that you want that wants to make an investment. I mentioned Midway Airport, and I am not familiar with all of the details, but what I have read and what I have been told is that in this partnership, what the city is looking for is not just to turn the airport over to someone to operate, but to have the operator there, but have the government, the city, share in the ongoing profits. Not just a one-time bang up front where they get $2 or $3 billion and there's no other revenue coming in, but it would be a steady stream of profit sharing. Folks, I've enjoyed being with you this morning. I've gone over my time a little bit, so I hope Mr. Lipinski will forgive me, and I hope the next panel will impose another 5 minutes on the following panel. Thank you.